let's see here. So yeah, so let's get going. Basically, today we're going to be talking about sound design, right? And I'm not going to lie, I feel like in the ongoing argument of where to spend your time, learning sound design obviously gets thrown around a lot in the music production community. I feel like every forum you go to, someone's like, "Oh, dude, just spend some more time on sound design. Like that's all you need." As if this is like just one little thing that's going to solve all your answers. And like yes, like sound design can be super valuable to learn, but I do feel like it can also be pretty damn harmful as well, right? The analogy that I actually like to use is kind of like with a sculptor. So think about it this way: if someone is carving out a statue out of like rock or clay, they don't start with the details, right? A sculptor would never start by just like carving out the details of like the fingers, right? Or the nails, like, or even the facial expression, like the eyelids. Like, a sculptor would just not start with that type of level of detailed information. All of those types of things would come later in the process. And in music, I really don't think that you should be spending too much of your time, like, at least initially, going into the absolute like depths of synthesis. Like, do you still need to know like how to use your tools, right? Like how to work with synths and sound design? Like, of course, in order to make good sounding music, you're going to have to learn a decent amount of sound design. But I don't think this is something that we all need PhDs in order to like be pretty good at, right? Again, we've all got, right, limited time, limited resources. And I don't think that spending the next like weeks, months, or even years like solely figuring out sound design is ever going to be the answer. So that's kind of like, the theme of today. I basically, like we're going to be kind of digging further into sound design, but really getting your sound design arsenal a bit more like, I guess, getting you to feel more comfortable and confident working with the foundations. And then in turn, that'll allow you to start creating some pretty epic sounds, some pretty unique sounds, right? And not sounding like a cutter version of like, or cookie cutter version, whatever that expression is, of your favorite artist, right? We don't want you to sound exactly like someone else. We want you to sound like a unique version of yourself. And we're going to be talking through a lot of those concepts today. So, super quick, I just want to introduce myself and also Zach. This will just be a few minutes, but I think it's really important to shed some light on where all of this information is coming from because, I just want you guys to know that you are in good hands. Like, we've been doing this for a really long time. It's our passion. It's what we love to do. And it's literally what we actually do pretty much all day, every day. So, my name is Sarek, and just this past year, I moved to Southern California. I was living in Brooklyn before that, and I produced under the name Hyperbits. I also had a side project called the Rooftop Boys. And between those two projects, I've done official remixes for Beyonce, for Tove Lo, for Nick Jonas, for Neon Trees, most recently Laid Back Luke, and just a bunch of other artists as well. I've signed original music and remixes to pretty much every major label at this point. So labels like Universal, Sony, Island Records, Ultra, EMI and Virgin, Robbins Entertainment, among, plenty of others. And basically across SoundCloud, YouTube, Spotify, I've had about 20 million streams of my music. I also just spend a shitload of my time teaching music production. I started an online school called the Hyperbits Masterclass, which we'll talk about later on. But, between all of those things, right, being an artist, teaching, doing some engineering work in one way or another, I've been pretty damn lucky that I've been part of over 15 Hype Machine #1 records. Now, super quick, you got, for anyone who signed on early, you heard Zach talking a bunch, right? So Zach is basically like originally was a student of the master class, but now he's the like an official co-instructor of the class and doing a lot of dope stuff as the producer and one half behind his production duo Science. He's actually done official remixes for artists like Tove Lo, John Newman. He won I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, Zach, but you won the Autograph and Steve Void remix competitions.
Yeah, on Weibo.
Yeah, and he's signed some record deals with Universal and Sony, but he's also kind of recently licensed some music to some pretty damn huge brands like Netflix, MTV, and Toyota. He's already got over 10 million streams of his music across all, the various streaming platforms. And I personally feel like he's just getting going, right? Like Science, his production duo, has really only been releasing music for a little bit over a year. So he's off to like one hell of an amazing start. So props to Zach. But basically, like I said, he's a masterclass co-instructor, and he's basically in charge of keeping our content super up to date. He's also like the Ableton Live expert within the masterclass, which is super awesome because I don't know, as many of you hopefully know, I produce in Logic. So he's always there to help clarify anything that might not make sense in another DAW. But anyway, beyond all of Zach's accomplishments, I just want to say he's like a really smart dude. He was actually an aerospace engineering major in college. And we've got him here to kind of start digging into the topic of sound design. So Zach, if you're ready to go, I'll just kind of hand it off to you and we can kind of get going and start talking about all things sound design.
Awesome. So yeah, if you guys are ready, maybe just throw like a yes in the chat, make sure you're all still with us, and then I can get going.
It's a lot of yeses.
Sweet. All right. So here we go. Sound design, right? Sarek was kind of mentioning before, there's so much that goes into sound design. We could have a whole hour webinar on like FM synthesis, right? Like it's just such a huge, it's almost like sound design itself is as big as like music production in general. So really kind of the purpose of this webinar and me really formulating my thoughts on sound design for all of you is to kind of really understand what I mean by having a good sound design theory. So you can really sit there and beat yourself over your head, like having all of these thoughts about how do I make this sound, or like why do my sounds not sound that good? And there's so many different rabbit holes you can go down. But you often, at least when I was first starting out, I always found myself in a position where I was so focused on achieving that like professional sound and the big sound design that I hear in all the artists that I like, that I almost would forget what I was doing in the first place, which is making full-length tracks, right? Like making a song that someone can listen to. And I would spend so much time focusing on sound design, and an extension of that would be like mixing in sound design, that I kind of lost the point. And I really think a big takeaway with today's lesson is like really understanding that what we're trying to do here is simplify the concept, the really complicated concept of sound design, into a theory that's like that makes perfect sense and that can get you from point A to point B, and have you excel with really good sounding sounds that are going to get the job done. So the kind of three main things here that I wanted to talk about first are the concept of having intention, moving quickly, and how important presets are. So first off, having intention, right? What do I mean by this? When you're in your DAW and you have a lead melody that you just wrote, maybe you did it on piano and you want to make a sound, you have to get to the point where you kind of have a direction you want to go. It's going to be nearly impossible for you to develop your own sonic identity and sound and like have like a unique flavor to your music if you don't already have intention of like what type of sounds you want to be making. You can't just go up to an empty DAW and like fumble through presets all the time and just happen to always get something cool, right? You got to listen to a lot of music. And if you have trouble with this, if you sit down and you have a melody or you have a chord progression and you really have no idea like what sort of sound you want to use, I recommend like taking some time to listen to some examples of other music that you're really vibing with at that time, and really focus your ears on listening to a sound and trying to, decide, do I want to make a sound that's similar to this? Because even just that little bit of push in a direction makes all the difference when you're dealing with sound design at the level at which I'm going to be explaining. So it's really important that you kind of decide before you really dive into designing a sound, or you going through presets, what you're looking for, and you can grow that over time. Now, it doesn't have to be perfect. You don't have to have like this perfect vision, like I know exactly the sound I want. Realistically, you just have to have an idea that gets you about 50% of the way there. You just need enough push in the direction of a sound to kind of get the ball rolling and allow you to find, presets that work for that sound, or understand like maybe the type of sound like synthesis you're looking for, or something that gets you in the direction. And usually over the course of composing the track, maybe getting some layering in there, some proper mixing, as long as you can get that first initial sound about like 50%, I'd say, the way there, you will end up with a final product that's functional, something that works and something that actually satisfies what your brain was hearing when you in your head when you kind of thought of the initial idea. Now moving quickly, also super important, because as Sarek was saying, like this concept of sound design is really only one part of the pie. And like I said, if you bog yourself down and you're working super heavily on sound design for a really long period of time, it can really kind of prohibit you from moving forward in a song. And, this is why often if I do feel like I just want to do sound design, I'll literally separate it from the whole composition process. I'll have whole specific, chunks of time, or even a whole day where I'm only there to make sounds and I'm not there to compose and write. Because one of the main reasons is because it takes away, it kind of changes the way your brain's working a little bit, but it's also because when you're composing, sometimes sound design leads itself to certain compositional decisions. So if you kind of move quickly and you just get a sound that is working and move on, it'll let your brain kind of sink into that vibe and that feeling that you're getting from that sound. And when you compose around it, you can come up with really cool compositional ideas because your brain's just firing off these like ideas rapid fire, like, oh, I want this filter to open up and I want this to do this. And you'll just kind of like progress further along. If you just force yourself to just not get hung up and not get stuck and frustrated and just push through. And then finally, kind of the big thing here that I know we talk a lot about in the masterclass, and we kind of dive into this a lot more in depth, but basically saying how presets really are the best way to move forward as an electronic music producer, unless you're devoting a chunk of your time to the concept of sound design, right? Like there's certain artists out there that come to mind, like people like Noisia and Matt Zoe and more. A lot of it's usually in the more experimental, bass-heavy electronic music because a lot of those genres are so focused on sound design. Excuse me. But basically, you have to be able to say to yourself, I know what type of producer I am, and I want to finish projects. And if you spend too much time on sound design, it's just really going to bog you down. And presets, there are companies out there that spend their entire, time as a company developing presets and advanced, really professional sounding sounds. And they can be expensive, but they can also be free. Like there's plenty of free databases out there. And, would you rather spend hours and hours and hours getting to a result, or get to that exact result just by a little bit of research and one day's worth of like going through presets and marking stuff down, right? I feel like getting to the finish line quicker in our line of work and making electronic music is just always going to be beneficial for your craft and your artwork for that matter, because you're always going to be forward thinking new ideas, like changing up what you're doing. And, if you do really feel like you need to spend a lot of time constructing things from the ground up 100% of the time, I mean, realistically, I just don't think that's that plausible if you're trying to be an actual electronic artist and not just a sound designer. But I mean, I would definitely encourage you to separate the two, like have sessions where you're doing sound design, have sessions where you're doing composition with those sounds. That would be kind of the way of moving forward with that. So really all these three things right here are all about time. And most of what we do is a race against the clock, right? Because, genres come and go, what's in, what's not in, like what's coming back, all that stuff kind of happens in these blink of an eye, really, when you think about it. And the more you can take away from the things that aren't the memorable things, and this is somewhat of a biased opinion, and also like, it's just my personal opinion, and I know Sarek agrees with me, but composition, if you think of kind of the three hemispheres or three, slices of what makes up an electronic song, or a pop song, or pretty much any song for that matter, you've got composition, sound design, and mixing. And usually it's about a third. You could attribute about a third to each, but as far as the time you need to spend in it. And really the goal here is we want you to be able to spend less time on sound design, less time on mixing, and more time on composition, because it's the composition decisions that are going to make your song, the music itself, really resonate with people and really last and be able for you to be able to grow an audience. There's little, sometimes certain artists are really just known for their sound design and maybe their compositions aren't that amazing, but that is definitely the fringe, right? Like most music, just in general, it's memorable because of compositional decisions. So don't worry about these numbers. This is kind of just like a general summary of it. But the whole idea here is we're spending less time on sound design, less time on mixing, more on composition. Now, when you go to sit down to hunt for a sound, the most important thing right out the gate is for you to get familiar enough with what you have at your arsenal and also just comfortable enough with what you're trying to make to be able to pick the right sound for the right job. And what I mean by that is if you're making a lead melody and this is like a dubstep song, right? You already know in your head that lead has to be of a certain caliber, right? It has to have a certain characteristics to it. It has to be the right sound. You can't just put like a piano unprocessed as your lead melody in a dubstep track, right? Like that would be ridiculous. And maybe you could process a piano hit and make it sound crazy, but you gotta, I find that one of the biggest problems is when you've, in a song that, like, for instance, if I hear from a student that I feel like the composition's there, the mixing's there, but something about it just doesn't feel right, it's usually because the source sound, the sound that they decided to start with just really wasn't the right sound for the right job. Now, 3 kind of breakdowns of this concept of the right sound. You've got software synths, right? Like things like Serum, Massive, anything that's a synthesizer on your computer, or for that matter, analog equipment, right? You could have like a actual hardware synthesizer that you're playing. Those create certain vibes and certain instruments and certain flavors, right? So that's one option. Your other option is a sample-based instrument, right? So something like Kontakt, Omnisphere, something where someone else has recorded and sampled a bunch of things, whether that's synthesizers or real-world instruments or whatever, and put it in a very convenient, playable, in-the-box, program so that you can write melodies and write chord progressions with it. That's kind of the biggest open-ended aspect of sound design, because anything can be a sample, right? Like you can go record Foley of rain outside your room and pitch it and make some cool bass line, or you could really do anything, and there's no point of diving into it too much because it's just so open-ended. But really just the main things I would want you to think about is something like Kontakt, right? Like having real instruments at your disposal, as well as sample libraries, right? Just pre-made loops and having just whatever they usually come from, software synths or samples of real-world instruments, but having access to a bunch of samples that you can use. And really, all 3 of these things, it's all about staying organized. If you collect this stuff, and I know I've been collecting samples and synths and romplers and stuff for 7 years now, and it wasn't until about 2 years ago that I really was like, okay, this is getting ridiculous. I have so many options when I'm sitting down to pick a sound. Why am I doing this to myself? Why not just find the sounds that I like, remember where those are and keep those organized, and then only add to it when I find something new that I like, and not just blindly download and save everything and just, and if I do download something and just save it just to have it, I make sure to go through it and know within it what I enjoy and what vibes, what I can do with certain types of sounds. And your organization here is really going to be key once I dive into kind of the sound identity theory that I'm about to talk about. Because once you're organized and once you know where to go in your computer, it just makes the whole process easy, fun, and really fast. I can just sit down in a session with a vocalist who's singing and really wanting to hear a song develop, and within 15-20 minutes have an entire verse, an entire chorus, and the beginning of a drop already kind of there and ready to go. And it might only be, like I said, 50% of the way there, but it's enough to create a vibe. And when you start to make more music and you start to work with more people, it really always, for me at least, always just comes down to vibe and like what can you do in a short period of time to, inspire someone else, or yourself, right? Like if you're not producing with people or you're not at that level yet where you're like having studio sessions with singers or something, just like you got to stay, inspired, and you got to stay excited. And if you're taking too long developing an idea or spending on sound design, I know I just get bored. Like I don't want to move on, and I don't have that energy and those ideas just rolling. So the more organized you are, just the better it's going to be. So with all that being said, I kind of want to dive in now to my concept of sound identity. And this is something I've sort of developed over the last year, taking kind of lots of bits and pieces from just the concepts of sound in general. And really, the purpose of this is to simplify all sound design and all possible sounds that you could ever use in a song into three main features. And once you understand those features, how you can utilize synths and samples, and manipulate those features to really achieve any result you want. And it seems like a really open-ended, kind of complicated thing when you hear it like that. But once you see this, it's pretty straightforward, and it's really going to help you move forward in a timely manner and really achieve the type of sound that you're going for. So the three concepts here that we're going to be talking about are shape, timbre, and environment. So I'm sure you've all heard these words before, but really explaining them when it comes to synthesis and sound design is huge, and how they relate to what we have at our disposal to use. So the first concept here, shape, also known as like your ADSR, right? Like your attack, decay, sustain, release. What is the sound's purpose? Like what is this sound? Is it a pluck? Does it have a really short attack and, no sustain at all? So it's just like a little transient, and then maybe like some release, so it like kind of fades out slower. Is it a pad? Does it have like a really long attack and kind of like slowly comes in? There's all of these sounds of types of instruments that we've learned about and heard, and really all the differences are usually some sort of ADSR change, right? Like you can make a pluck into a pad very quickly. I'll bring up here just like a simple serum patch real quick, and you can see that like even if I just get a basic saw, just a saw wave going, envelope 1 here for serum is the global ADSR. So right now, it's just, when I press a note, it just plays because the attack is here and it's just fully sustained. So if I held down like 3 notes, right? But then if I just simply move this down, the sustain all the way down, move the decay, and just like that sound has completely transformed kind of its function and like what it is. And so that right there is huge, because you can open up any preset and just really quickly listen, like what is the shape of this sound? Like what is this sound accomplishing? And knowing this synth, I know like, okay, if let's say I really like one aspect of the sound, but I want to change the shape, knowing really quickly how to do that and being able to experiment in that way really fast is huge. So timbre kind of feeds into that. So every sound has a shape and it has a timbre. And timbre, which I'm sure you've all heard this word, it's really not that complicated. It's basically just the characteristic of a sound. So what differentiates, a C1 note on a piano from a C1 note on a string, from a C1 on a serum patch to a C1, wherever you are in nature, right? Things can have the same exact frequency and pitch, right? They can hit that same resonant tone, but everything that we hear sounds different. And that's all timbre is really meant to be for, is like, how do you describe the differences between something that's hitting at the same pitch? So timbre in like the sound design world is simply just, what is that characteristic? Like what makes that sound warm? What makes it bright? Like what's that flavor that's creating the tone? And, we've got these basic wave shapes like saw waves, there's sine waves, square waves. Those are all the kind of like digital timbres that exist out there, and there's just thousands of sounds you can make by combining those and affecting them and doing cool stuff. But it's also like, there's all the real world instruments out there, like there's strings, and all these things have different unique timbres. So being able to know when you pull up a patch, like what's creating this timbre, in something like Serum, we're talking about oscillators here. And so timbre is huge, because once you understand that, you can know, okay, this sound is achieving something really nice. Why is it achieving that? Like, what about this timbre makes me feel like the sound is warm and big? And you can start to investigate and figure that out. Now, the final thing with sound identity is the environment, right? Like, where does this sound feel like it is, and what is the sound doing in your mixing environment, in your speakers, right? This is something like your spatial effects and just your like reverbs and things like that. This is, often an added thing, right? Like, this is something you could apply or do after the fact in your sound design, but it's extremely important, because placing a sound in an environment is huge to making it feel authentic and real and lifelike. So those three things together, once you understand those concepts, and any sound, no matter how complicated the sound, can be broken down into those three things. And you could listen to anything and write down, like, what's the shape, what's the timbre, what's the environment. And knowing those is really going to help you moving forward. Now, the question I'm sure you're having now is, okay, so I understand this. I understand like what sound identity is, but how can I use that to my advantage, right? Like, how can I hear a sound and be able to immediately make a decision based off of that sound, and either fix a problem or understand what's cool about it, and learn that and take that into the future in your sound design. And really, it all comes down to knowing sound design, all those three concepts in a synth, right? Or knowing them so well that you can immediately go to a program and adjust it to do exactly what you want it to do. And I really can't stress how important it is to pick like one synth that you like, and you're comfortable with, and understand how to manipulate those three things super quick and efficiently in that synth. So for me, I'm a Serum guy, right? Like, I love Serum. I think for many reasons. For one, it just sounds awesome, but two, it's also visually very like interesting for me. I feel like it's very intuitive, and it just makes a lot of sense in my book. And so I've just gotten to learn Serum. I mean, I downloaded Serum, I think the second week it was out. And I've been using it for like years now, and it's just an amazing synth when it comes to developing those three parameters. Now, I'm going to focus the rest of this on just Serum, because I want to make sure that we can get into some of these three characteristics in depth with at least one synth. But you have to remember that all of this can be applied to any synth, and for that matter, any piece of audio, right? Like, you can even like take a piece of audio that's already recorded, change the timbre by doing things like saturation and distortion and things like that. You can change the shape and the ADSR with like fades and cutting up the audio. You can do it with anything, but with a synth, it's pretty nice because you have ultimate control. So simply put, the three categories with Serum: shape, timbre, environment. So shape, envelope one, and any sort of modulations that you have, are going to dictate your shape, right? So if I bring up this patch again, obviously, like right here, I've just got a simple square or pulse. And this envelope one is heavily dictating the general shape of the patch. So I can move that around, change it up however I want. But, you can also have other things contributing to it. So if I were to grab a random preset, so even though envelope one is just a full-on like a knit patch, right? Like it's full sustain, nothing happening. You have to look in a synth like Serum at any sort of modulation that's happening, because oftentimes other envelopes and other LFOs are changing the shape of the sound. They're making the actual ADSR change. And it just might not always be the actual ADSR that's changing. It could sometimes be like a filter being engaged, taking out frequencies that's creating an effect as if we were, changing the global ADSR. So with Serum, first thing I'm doing when I'm opening up a preset and like trying to understand it is I'm looking at all these envelopes and all these LFOs, what's going on, what's affecting that shape. So you can see with this one, it's pretty simple. You've got that same sort of plucky shape. that's making the high frequencies cut out in this shape right here. Now, timbre in Serum is also super straightforward, and really where Serum, in my opinion, shines the most and gives you the most kind of flexibility, especially when you start stacking and layering and all that good stuff. And really in Serum, timbre all comes from your wavetables and your oscillator sections, and obviously like effects. So in this sound, this entire sound is just made up of these two wavetables, right? There's some effects in here. There's some compression, some distortion, a little bit of reverb, and a little bit of boosting with an EQ and filtering. But this is the main source, right? Your oscillators A and B are going to heavily dictate that characteristic, that timbre, and that fullness of a sound. So if you're dealing with a patch that, like, let's say you really love the shape of it and like the effects going on, but it just doesn't hit hard enough, or it's not feeling full enough, to me that immediately screams, okay, there's an issue with your timbre, and you should go adjust that and take the time to try out new timbres. So like, for instance, if I didn't like this, I've saved up so many timbres from so many wavetables over the course of the last few years, so I can immediately go in and, find another timbre. So if I go to grab something, and I'll actually turn off one just to make it simplified. And it's really endless, and this is where Serum just kind of destroys every other soft synth out there, is the ability to spend like as much time as you want honing in on that timbre to get as unique of a sound as possible. And most of the time when you hear like the guys out there who are making, and this really comes to mind for like heavy bass music, like people like Nightmare and Slander and Boombox Cartel and stuff, when you hear their songs and you're like, wow, like how'd they make that sound? Usually the shape and the effects and the mixing like isn't anything crazy. I mean, it's definitely high caliber and it sounds great, but usually what you're hearing that's unique is really interesting timbres, right? They've spent a lot of time going through wavetables and utilizing, warping modes to combine wavetables to really kind of get unique flavor to their sounds. And that's really where you can spend where I would recommend spending the most amount of time doing, if you're going to be spending time on sound design, is really fleshing out that source, what's creating the actual timbre of the sound, because that's the most important thing to getting like a really full developed sound. Now, finally, environment, right? Where it sits. This can be done outside of a synth, and I normally do this outside of a synth, but I will always use the effects section in Serum to create certain things. Like, for instance, the compressor I use in almost every patch with multiband engaged, which is essentially just OTT from Xfer's like OTT plugin. And what this basically does is it's just upward and downward compression happening at the same time. It's really just going to kind of fatten up the sound, flatten out the frequency spectrum, and just make anything sound a little bit bigger. So if I even just play this sound, right? It's brighter, it's fuller, it just feels more polished and essentially like, quote unquote mixed, and like almost like it's mini mastered. And a lot of that's simply just the standard OTT settings, but Serum's great because you can dive in here and be more particular. So if there's too much high end, you can bring down the levels of the high end, or same with like mids, whatever, and you can really dive in and get kind of just basically take whatever sound you have and fatten it up a little bit more. So I don't want to dive too much into spatial effects, things like reverb and all that, because again, that's just like a whole nother concept, a whole nother thing. And we do dive into every single like type of effect very in depth in the masterclass. But it's just something that I feel like would take too much time away from moving on to like an in-use example. So without further ado, I'm just going to kind of dive into a track I recently finished with my buddies Paper Wings. It's going to be a collaboration, and my friend Winter, who's singing. And first I'm just going to play a little bit of it so you can kind of hear the vibe, and then I'm going to dive into sort of the main synth sound that happens in the drops, which is basically kind of like a future bass chord sound. But I'm really happy with this sound. I think it has a very unique flavor to it. And I think that, it would be really it'd be a lot better for me to dive into a real world example of synthesis in one of my projects instead of just, flicking through presets and showing you like one-off things. Because like we were mentioning, all of this stuff interlaps, right? Like everything is related to one another, and you have to be able to understand sound design, but you also have to be able to understand how that sound design relates to everything else to get that final polish that you're looking for. And oftentimes I find that the sounds themselves aren't as impressive as everything working together as a whole. So before I just play this through, I just want to make sure everyone's still with me. If you want to just throw a yes in the chat, just so I know that we're still everyone's still there and getting excited. And I don't know if Sarek, you can. I'm sure everyone's been saying yes, but
yeah, everyone is saying yes, and I think everything you're saying so far has been pretty damn awesome. Like it's, I mean, super clear, and I'm personally just looking forward to you diving into this kind of next phase. And like you said, like it's one thing to be pulling up the synth and explaining a few buttons here and there, and looking at a few presets, but to actually make this stuff work inside of a track, like that's everything, right? That's how you apply any sort of a knowledge and bring it into a real world environment. So everything that we just talked about, like, is pretty much worthless if you're not putting it inside of music. So
exactly.
This is, for me at least, this is where the juicy stuff really starts with a much, now that we have a little bit more of a foundation of how you approach sounds in general.
Cool. All right, sweet. So I'm just going to go play through kind of like the break drop of this, and then I'm going to dive into this chord sound.
I get so used to cloudy days, I try to justify the rain. I hold too tightly to the pain, my expectations start to change. I wanna wake up weightless, I want the sun on my face. Let the skies just open up, I let it all float away.
Cool. All right, yeah. So pretty dope, like uplifting track. I'm really happy with this one. But really, this sound, right, the main saw sound coming in is really everything. I have a frozen version here, just to conserve CPU, but we'll dive into the actual version up here. So if I go ahead and just turn solo this one. So, right off the bat, even though it seems like it's just, one sound, this full super saw thing is, 8 layers coming in here, right? There's 8 different things going on all at once, mixed. And then furthermore, those 8 things are processed together. There's sidechain going on. There's a lot of these racks are just simple automations that happen later on in the track, like for little changes in movement. But the main sound, like the core of it is the concept of stacking all of these layers at once. So I'm just going to kind of go through real quick each layer one at a time so you can kind of hear all the pieces working as a whole. And then I'll kind of show you my approach to how I decided, like, okay, I'm going to keep going. I'm going to keep adding something. I'm going to manipulate this layer. But before I do that, all of this started with a nice chord progression, right? I had a chord progression that worked. It was working for the vocal. I flew that through. And for me, with like these kind of future-based chord sounds, it's all about timbre in my book. Like it's pretty easy to use like something like an LFO tool and, just drawing in MIDI to get stuff to turn on, turn off, and kind of wobble. But it's really getting that like fullness and that like nice warm timbre that I really strive for. So without further ado, I'm just gonna start with I'll go ahead and start with this layer. So this layer, it was I believe the first layer that I made. And when I work with like super sawy sounds like this, one thing that I've kind of learned is that the stereo image is huge. Like when it comes to this type of sound, knowing that what room you have to work with in the stereo field really helps fatten up sounds, because a synth like Serum or Massive or any of those, they're stereo synths, but they still have a very like middle focus, and they don't really get crazy wide feeling without you having to apply some additional processing. So in this case, you know, the patch itself is actually just a preset. It's from the Singular Sounds Volume 2 that actually came out pretty recently. And it's just this Millennium saw. It's kind of like based off of Millennium. And it's just a saw wave, detuned, some white noise, and then just this other unique kind of timbre here. But this would be a great example for you to hear like how important something like this was, right? Like if I take this off and you hear the sound. So a subtle layer like that, like just adding in a low volume layer to that, just kind of gives it a slight more edge than just having like a saw wave. And it's little decisions like that. I mean, obviously this preset was already made for me, so they kind of did that on their own, but that was something I noticed in this layer that like I really enjoyed hearing, and it really came through in the final product. So, you know, starting with that sound, knowing I was going to make like a big kind of super sawy sound, the one thing I made sure to do is all of my envelopes on all these patches, they're all just the same, because I want everything to feel like one sound, and I'm going to control the movement of that sound on a global level on the group, and not like on every individual patch, because then I'd be like copying and pasting a lot of automation and shit like that. So this is kind of like my approach. And with this layer, you know, a weird thing that I did, but that really helps and just fills out the sound so much, is I use an imager and like aggressively image almost the entire thing, like other than the sub, anything below 140, right? This isn't something normally you'd see done, is just over the top imaging. And if you look at it, so what that's doing is it's really just making the sound feel purely stereo, right? Once I engage that ozone, it doesn't really feel like there's a lot going on in the middle. And when you layer that with other versions of itself with slightly different timbres in the middle, the whole thing just feels a lot bigger. So I'll come back and I'll turn this one on once we go through some of these, so you can really feel that added energy. And that's just something like I've kind of stumbled upon and developed as sort of like a thing that really helps with these kind of big saw sounds. Now, this next layer, this is kind of the traditional like super sawy layer, right? It's really simple. I think I just made it really quick. It's just 2 saw waves, and they're both detuned pretty much the same amount, maybe a little more on this one, same octave. So really just like pushing a really aggressively, no effects or anything, just an over the top detuned layer to kind of fill up the spectrum. Listen to these two together now. So, you know, definitely different timbres. And when you get into layering, and again, something like it's sort of just a whole nother topic to talk about, a big thing about it is making sure you're not layering the exact sound one on top of another. So layering these two together is really important here, because it really fills out the spectrum. Now, this sound is very similar to the combination of these two together, but it's got a little bit more of kind of like modulation going on and movement in the stereo image. So all of them together kind of creates a fuller sound, even though the timbre of this one is pretty similar, right? It's a little more detuned. Make this bigger for you. And there's some filtering going on, some noise, and a little more effects like some hyper, which is kind of creating some phasing. So these three together now. pretty subtle. It's sort of just like an energy level. It's just like another layer there to provide some more energy, and it's mixed pretty quietly. So it's sort of just, that's one thing I'm often doing when I'm stacking sounds to make it bigger, is just bringing things in at really small volumes, like low levels. That can really help just fill out the sound, especially when you process them together. And then the final like kind of saw layer is sort of another detuned, but more sort of tinty and high-end layer that it isn't really like, doesn't have a lot of low-mid punch. And I also have a square wave making up the kind of majority of that timbre. So since I've been doing so many saw-based layers, having some square layers in there really helps kind of, again, fill it out in a different way. And this is actually, again, another preset from that same pack, and it's based off of the 2Me saws. So all these together now So, you know, those four things, right? Like, you might have heard one when you were initially searching through presets, like, oh, I like this. But I just know from experience that with this sort of sound, you're never going to get the fullness and the energy you want from just one like kind of saw-based patch. You usually got to think about the stereo image and knowing like, okay, I just need more energy, more information happening, because that's going to really fill it out and just get it to that, like, you know, like how Illenium and those people have those big saws. And as far as processing, you know, you can see it's all pretty minimal. Like, I'm definitely taking out sub information, like with these EQs. And then I often use the transient master in my chain as simply just as a clipper. So I'm not actually doing anything other than engaging the transient master at the end of the chain. And all that's doing is that's preventing, a track from clipping. So if I turn this off and you look at it here, it's clipping pretty bad. So all I'm doing is engaging that to kind of chop off any sort of peaks that go above 0. That way, I can still retain really loud, like not very dynamic sounds. And then at the end process, that just makes my master a little bit bigger and more modern and loud. So that's kind of the saw section. And then quickly here, I want to go through now the low end of the sound, because that's where I really think makes these big saw sounds shine through. And one really important layer is this one, which all it is in the MIDI is it's actually the root note of every chord. So for instance, F major is happening, C, A sharp. So I'm taking that root note and just creating a like saw, kind of like how Zed used to make those like really saw heavy basses, just to kind of hammer home that these chords are what they are, right? So that, you know, like when this chord's playing, that it's an F chord. So if I were to kind of A, B this one on and off, so with it, so it's just a little bit extra like low mid punch, and also kind of gives it a little bit of sharp noise through the top end, which just kind of, again, it's almost like just an addition to these saw layers to really hammer that idea home. And all that is in Serum. It's actually, it's not even Serum, it's Massive. So, great idea with when you are stacking lots of layers is use different synths, because having different timbres that are literally created from different sound sources, different programming, different code, it can be hugely advantageous, because you're automatically forcing the computer to recognize like different timbres, right? There's no way Massive is going to sound exactly like Serum, right? Like, you're going to get some variations, and that can be really cool. And this is super simple, right? I think I just made this. It's just a saw wave, and it's obviously at a lower register so that it feels like bass. And then there's just some Bronner tube saturation here to just kind of like fatten it up. So that layer, and then I think this is the layer Yeah, this is kind of the big one for these big saw sounds that I'm always hearing a lack of in when someone's first like getting to the stage where they're building like a really authentic sound like this, is not having enough bass in your chords and not having enough of that like punch and energy. So for me, where I got that was I found this really cool preset, and again, no effects, just taking out some sub, and it was just called Some Minds. Again, Singular Sounds. I think it's from their first pack though. Just a really nice, warm, kind of like flangey bass that just really hammers home the root notes of those chords. And this is a great example of how to create movement within layering that isn't over the top complicated, and that isn't going to distract from the purpose of the sound. So this sound, right, like if all of these saw layers had different ADSRs and like the shape of the sounds was all over the place, it would be really hard to convince you that it was all one sound. And even when you stacked them all and processed them together, they'd feel kind of dissonant from one another and weird. But bass is a great example of something that you can definitely change the ADSR and the flavor of it within a layer, and still achieve what you're going for. And I actually think that's all. This whole sound wouldn't be anything without this layer, because what this does is it kind of makes the saws feel a little bit more stab-like, because it's modulating the cut. This envelope is modulating the cutoff, which is essentially letting in high frequencies and then bringing them back. That like movement there is providing so much characteristic for this sound. So if I were to go in here, turn all these on, and then I'm going to turn this one on and off. Sorry. So that, like, not only is it obviously fulfilling frequencies that we're not hitting very well with these layers, but the movement itself is also really nice. I can actually just turn off that movement real quick so we can hear what it would sound like without it. Right? Like, having it just in fulfills the energy that we're lacking in the spectrum, right? The saws feel bigger and warmer, but they don't feel as interesting, and there's not as much like character to them. So definitely experimenting with the shape of your bass layers. Obviously, like if you just had a different bass line going, that would be like, again, like you could have a different shape and it would be okay. But with this sort of big sound, like this is kind of something that works. And then I think then in this finally is another bass layer, and I often find that layering your basses in a big sound like this with a really detuned wide sound can really also help make it feel really full. So this is just like a respace kind of sound. Again, just a preset, and it's just a really detuned saw, and then kind of a slightly detuned like, you know, wavetable that sounds Reese, and a lot of the high end is taken out. And furthermore, I obviously eliminated sub information, and then I went ahead and used mid-side EQ and boost the hell out of the mids the hell out of the mid-range on the side. So at about 569 hertz, I boosted like 5 dBs, and again at like 2.3 kilohertz, just to really force this layer out of the way of this layer. So together, those work really well at just feeling like full and having a lot of low end energy. So, you know, again, all these things together, I'm actually just going to transfer over to the process, or the completely audio one. And then, so that's essentially all this is the consolidated all of those layers down and then processed, right? So I've got a pretty decent processing chain on here, that's all it's really doing is just really amping up the energy. So if I turn this off, And, I don't want to go too into it. It's for a whole nother conversation, but, just some basic EQ, taking away some low end, some saturation with FabFilter Saturn, a little bit of drive and energy with something called the inflator, which is kind of like sort of saturation, but technically not. Some glue compression, a little bit more EQ boost on the high end, and then again just a little bit more EQ, which is kind of boosting some specific frequencies that sound nice and warm with kind of like an analog emulated EQ, and then again just cutting out some mud that was there and making sure there's no sub, because when you layer this layer with the actual sub, you really want to make sure you're not conflicting frequencies. So I'm cutting them all at the final stage. So, all of that put together and all of those concepts interworking with my sound design choices got me to that level, and to that final product. It wasn't like one patch, one thing, but I knew when I went into it, okay, what do I want to make? I want to make like a big super saw sound that has an interesting rhythm, and I want to make sure that like it feels like grimy and has low end but also has grit and energy on the high end. So I started making layers. I found a preset that kind of got me 50% of the way there, right? Like this sound just sort of did it for me right there. And then I was like, okay, how can I make this? I like the shape. I actually wrote probably or just went with the Paper Wings guys, went through and decided on the rhythms and the variations probably throughout the whole song, because this drop is slightly different from this drop, which is slightly different from the third one. So deciding on all that, you can do all of that when you're only like 50% of the way there, and then going through and deciding, okay, now I want to fatten this up. I want to do some sound design. What is this layer lacking, right? Is it a timbral lack? Is it a shape lack? I thought it was a little bit of both, right? It was kind of straight and didn't have a lot of movement to it. So it's like, okay, maybe I should add a bass layer that has a little bit more movement, right? Something like this. And already you're getting even closer, right? That 50%'s now like 60, 70. And I just know from experience, stacking more saw waves that are slightly different, as well as some square waves, adding a couple more, noisy layers, processing them together. I actually didn't even go over the lead one, I just noticed. But again, this is like a lead layer. So this is just silent. I think it's like it's just in a knit patch, like a detuned saw wave. And then there's just some reverb, Ableton built-in reverb to make it sound like shittier. And these are actually not engaged right now because I didn't need them. And just a little bit of boost, right? So that's like another layer added on to just fill up the top end a little bit more. So, I hope that sort of is showing you like, it's not as easy as just to say like, okay, this is how you do sound design and like this is what you do. It's a lot of moving pieces, and you have to have that intention, and then you have to understand like, what am I trying to accomplish? How can I get there? How do I manipulate the sound identity in a synth really well? Learn it, go through your presets, know the presets that get you 50% of the way there, that get you to where you want, and then just start stacking, start doing mixing, start, manipulating timbres, manipulating shapes, getting the sound a little further along and a little more towards the final product that you want.